Friends, I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Bill Enright, who is the Senior Pastor Emeritus of our congregation, who is a powerful and prophetic voice in our city, who really was a church builder in his time at Second Presbyterian Church. And Bill, thank you very much for taking a little bit of time to share with me and with your congregation. Of course, you and Edie continue to be very active in the life of Second Church. Your most important role at Second Church these days is the spouse of an active elder. And we're so glad to have Edie on our session right now. But I am engaging in some conversations that I hope will allow our congregation to both see itself in the context of its history, but also really claim its call for this moment. And there is no one better suited to guide us through that than you, Bill. And so I just want to, with your permission, just ask you a few questions and see if you can kind of walk us through your own history as well as how that intersects Second and its ministry. So thank you, first of all, for taking a little time this afternoon to do this. So I would love to just ask if you would tell us kind of how you developed your understanding of what pastoral leadership looks like and how you have exercised that pastoral leadership in the various contexts you've served leading up to Second and then through Second.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's an honor to have a conversation with you, and it's a real pleasure for me to be known as Edie's spouse, and to be in that role at this time in my life. I look back on my life. I have been so blessed. I've been blessed in the people who have been my mentors, my teachers, my education. I was finishing an advanced degree in those days, what was called THM at McCormick Seminary. And one day I was working in history and preaching, and my professor knew that I had to do a thesis, and they said, we have a street on this campus called Chalmers Place, but no one knows who Chalmers was. Well, he was this 19th century, the key figure really in 19th century Scottish history, and that's what really got me into that era. Well, one of the things that most impressed me was that the Scottish concept of the congregation at that time was rooted in a geographical idea of parish. Mm-hmm. So a church had a parish with pretty definitive geographical boundaries. And what did it mean to be the presence of God in that situation? Thomas Chalmers was great preacher. He was a systematic theologian. But while he was a pastor in Glasgow, he felt the need to build a new church that would really take urban ministry seriously and caring for the underserved and addressing the needs of poverty and education. And that concept came with me, so that my first call was as an associate pastor in the south side of Chicago, a community called Roseland. It was largely a Dutch ethnic population. And in the early 60s, there was, frankly, there was a lot of prejudice. And I recall with another Presbyterian minister, we'd been classmates. He was a neighboring church. We kind of started a counter-community organization to try to create conversation and dialogue. I remember one Friday night, there was supposed to, all the word was out there would be a big riot. And we found ourselves roaming the streets. I found myself one day the first white person on the porch of a black minister in the area whose home had been firebombed. So we knew the issues we had to address as God's people in that particular setting. I then went to Scotland for 3 years to do my PhD. And when I came back, I ended as the senior pastor of a western suburb in Chicago, Glen Ellen. Came there in '69. But I arrived back in this country in August of 1968. And that was I'll say almost a revolutionary time. That was the time when you had the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, so Edie and I and our two boys were visiting my mother, and then we drove to Chicago to see her parents. And I still remember the shock as we came on to Route 66, and miles and miles and miles of military convoys, National Guard. I'm in Glen Ellen, which is a very lovely, affluent suburb. Most of the people worked in Chicago. Chicago, you have these railroad lines that run north, south, and west. And we were on one of the western lines, so most of our people worked in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So I felt, we have a relationship. We have a responsibility to the city, not simply to our own community. And it was a wonderful congregation that was so committed to that. What we did over time is we became the first essentially white suburban church to build a relationship with a Black inner city congregation. It took us 3 years to build trust and dialogue, but that relationship just became a redemptive, a renewing experience for our congregation and their congregation, but it also sensitized me to the issues of urban life and issues of racism in a powerful way. And then in 1980, I was called to Second Presbyterian Church, and as we were negotiating, frankly, with the PNC. One of the things I said is that, what's the urban mission that Second Presbyterian has? And so there was a commitment 100% from the PNC that we were going to create some kind of relationship. And they followed right up. It took us more like 6 months rather than 3 years. And we had a wonderful relationship with Westminster. Westminster neighborhood and all of that we know today has grown out of that relationship. However, one thing I learned in those two relationships also was that the relationships between, when you focus on congregational relationships, it ebbs and flows, and whenever there is a change in one of the congregations in pastoral ministry, that influences and affects that relationship. So we had our highs and our lows. I had been in Indianapolis 10 years, and talking with one of our elders one day, Steve Stoughton, I said, Steve, there's something missing in my life. I said, I do not know the Black clergy in our city. It's as if we live in separate worlds. And so that's where the name Tom Benjamin surfaced. He was really, I would say, if not one of the leading voices of Black clergy. And so Steve made a connection, and Tom and I, and also the rabbi from the Jewish Temple on Meridian Street, we began to meet. And we probably met for 2 to 3 years. And initially it was just the three of us sharing our stories, getting together once a month. And then we began to bring lay people onto that conversation. And then in the early 90s, you remember there was the Rodney King incident in LA. And we became aware that we felt in our conversations that Indianapolis was like a tinderbox, that they're waiting to explode. So we scheduled an appointment with the mayor, Steve Goldsmith, and the three of us. And the purpose of that was simply to say, how can we be a catalyst for peace and reconciliation in the city? What can we do? The outcome of that was a task force to address issues of racism called Vision Indianapolis. And Tom and I became the co-chairs of that task force for the mayor. The rabbi had moved. So that really solidified our relationship. And then as our relationship grew, that in turn gave birth to the Celebration of Hope. Initially it was our two congregations. First meeting was Clues Hall. It was full. We did not realize that we were doing something that had never been done before, in which two congregations would literally close their campuses and meet in a neutral site. That, I recall, was the day of a Pacers playoff game. But two of the major networks did their noon news from Clues on that day. And we did that for several years. Then we said we need to try to expand this. And so we grew to quite a number of congregations and moved the site to Market Square Arena in those days. Along with that, about that time also came 9/11. And I think one of the things I learned at 9/11, that night of 9/11, second, it was televised, a service for the entire city for a prayer and reconciliation. And because we had the bridges built with the Black community, with the Jewish community, etc., we could make this, and with our Protestant and Catholic clergy, we could make that an interfaith service. And I guess what I came away with that is, in times of crisis, it's almost too late to build bridges. The bridges have to have been built before, and they can then become foci for reconciliation and conversation. And that in turn actually then at Second Church, help me, I'm spacing the name, the renewal Great Banquet. When the Great Banquet came, I remember Jim Riley talked to me. I said, Jim, we will do this under two conditions. It must be interracial and it must be ecumenical. I have to say, to this day, for me personally, some of those relationships continue to flourish.
Yes. Well, and as I listen to your to you walk through that history, there are some markers of the road. There are some common threads that I think weave throughout. The words I wrote were dialogue, conversation, trust, relationship, bridges, and perhaps at the core, personal relationships. And I think of how you really began with how do we build interpersonal bridges before we build institutional bridges. And it seems to me like one marker of your leadership was, I, Bill, can establish a relationship with you, Tom, and through that, we can see our communities together in different ways. So as you think about sort of excellent pastoral leadership, I would imagine that relationship building across those gulfs that divide us has to be one sort of essential part of that.
Yeah, if I could put it in a biblical model,
Yes.
It's the shepherd model.
Yes.
And it's the good shepherd. The shepherd model underscores the power of the pastoral. It's a story of a God who's always on the move, where your people are on the move. It's a story of a God who speaks amidst the events that are occurring at the moment in our lives. It's the power of care, the power of prayer, of beneficence, God in motion.
Yes.
Ron Heifetz has a metaphor that was very important to me when I discovered it quite a few years ago. He talks about leadership as living on the balcony. And you imagine yourself at a dance. And if you're on the level of the dance floor and the dance floor is crowded, it's just, you see a mass of people. But if you stand on the balcony, you begin to look down and you see who is partnering with whom. Where are the connections that are being made? And that begins to tell you something about pastoral care, about issues. It's also listening to people's yearnings, their hopes, their dreams, their losses. Um, One thing that was revolutionary for me in my ministry was my last year at Edinburgh, I stumbled on a little book by a man by the name of Stephen Verney, and it was titled Fire at Coventry. And it's the story of, it goes back to World War II, when the Coventry Cathedral was completely destroyed except for part of the altar. Yeah. And so the new cathedral was built, and you consecrate in the Anglican tradition a cathedral. And Stephen raised the question, but how do you consecrate a people? Mm-hmm. And he began to, he did it with small groups. So that my first year in Glen Ellen and my first year and a half at Second, it was wonderful. I came that once a week, we didn't go in the summer, that an elder or a deacon would invite anywhere from 15 to 25 people to their home. And we would begin with coffee and dessert, and we sat in a circle. And I was new, so they wanted to know about me, but I said, I'm really here to learn from you. Talk to me about how do you see, in this case, Second Church? What are your hopes and dreams? And the conversations were so wonderful. We had talked about the need for intercity ministry. I remember a wonderful leader at Second Church, now deceased, Bill Hall. And I remember in one of the meetings, Bill said, we used to have our urban ministry. We called it Meyer Chapel.
Yes.
When that Meyer Chapel closed, we lost something. They need to regain it. Well, that's the link.
Yes.
But see, that was from the congregation. Right. And that it was such a natural connection. I found issues that needed to be addressed. And probably by the end of that second year, through the members of the church, they were being addressed. I think that was pivotal. It was listening.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder, as you think about our current context, I think there's so much that sort of translates from your experience. And in many ways, just at a very personal level, I'm so inspired by your ministry at Second and what you were able to do, and you and the congregation together were able to do. And I've told the story before that the first person I met with the first day I was in the city of Indianapolis was Bill Enright, because the pastor nominating committee that was interviewing and in conversation with me felt it was so important that we have time together. And I will never forget that breakfast meeting, and I'll never forget asking you about sort of the DNA of Second Church, and your two-word response was public church. And that set a fire for me in this sense of call and discernment to this position, because if I were to describe the church that I want to serve, it is a church that cares about, deeply invested in the context where it sits, that is a public church. And I certainly have found that to be core in my now 2 years and 1 day at Second. And it feels to me as if this moment that we're in now both asks for and even demands of us that role as a public church. And I wonder how, as you put into this context your experience, what do you think that might look like for us, and what would you encourage and challenge us to in this time?
Well, let me backtrack, because I well remember that morning as well, Chris. And that was a gift for me. And I cannot say how delighted and providential for me it is to have you as our pastor. I think your leadership through this time of crisis, I never faced anything as deep as what we have faced with the pandemic, and now coupled on that, the race issues that have ignited over the past week.
Yes.
And the way you are handling that, I can only applaud and say thank you. I want to say, I think I sent you an email, but your words on Sunday were powerful. But they were powerful because they were framed in such empathy. Your tears almost, your care, your compassion. We know we must act and do. What do we do? How do we act? The public church of Second, it's not really about you as senior pastor. It's not about me when I was senior pastor. It is a marvelous congregation because of the people who are there. How do we serve those people? How do we engage people who are in leadership positions across the city? How do we engage them in care, in conversation? I think for me, it's sitting down and it's listening and engaging in conversation because there's wisdom there. And, two minds sitting down and probing a problem, or many minds, you begin to find some solutions. So it's expressing our care for those people. I have no idea what the future will look like, except there's something inside me that says I think it's going to be significantly different from what has been. I think the pandemic, technology, the quarantine is going to alter somewhat how we understand and do church. And so I guess, my prayer is that Second will be open to making the changes, making the adjustments, making the innovations. I find innovation to be an interesting word because you innovate from something. You innovate from a certain base. And the vision that you are casting for Second, I think the way you close your introduction to worship each Sunday, that we are a community of faith where Jesus Christ transforms life. That's the base. Now, how do we innovate off of that? What does that mean to take that vision and bring it to birth in what's going to be a new era where I suspect that more and more programming may well come through live streaming. And what are the missionary, the evangelistic opportunities that it's, I suspect that we're not just serving members of Second Church, but there are people out there who, amidst the chaos of culture, are saying, is there something more? Am I part of something bigger than myself than I've thought about before? And in their search, they start visiting sites. So frankly, I see those as exciting opportunities.
Yes. Yeah, it sort of is another definition of a public church. I think what it means to be a public church when your reach can extend without folks having to leave, their own homes. There is certainly something lost in not being together in person with each other. I certainly feel it every Sunday morning these days, and yet there is no denying, based on the statistics we're seeing, based on the feedback we're receiving, that we are reaching a broader and wider community of worshipers right now. And so my question has been, what is the Spirit of God saying to us through that, which I think is another of those leadership questions. God is speaking. There is something to be learned. Our question, the question we ask ourselves is, what is the Spirit of God teaching us through this time? How do we innovate? How do we innovate to catch up?
What does that call for? And I think how does one create community amidst that means of communication?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Those are the very questions that we are asking in new and different ways. And I do think to some extent we've been pushed into some conversations that perhaps the church should have been having already, speaking the broad church, the Christian community around the world. these are conversations that the time would beg of us anyway.
I was thinking just yesterday about this, and for some reason my mind tripped back to a tour that I led in the early '90s. Second Church members, kind of our Reformation heritage, but just the year earlier, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and we one evening we found ourselves in Leipzig, Germany. And to the fall of the wall, to the collapse of communism in Germany, the breakdown of the East German, was what was called a service of prayer at the Nikolai Church in Leipzig. The government said you can't do protests, so they said, you know how we'll do this? We're going to have a prayer meeting once a week, and that prayer became the catalyst for the social change that emerged. So I do not want to. I kept thinking, pray for Indy. How do we create something like that? Because I do believe in the power of prayer.
Yes.
And as we sort through the wisdom and discernment.
Yes, I love the proverb, "Pray but move your feet." You know that often it is my feet begin moving when I pray for the courage to take the next step. So I love so much of your ministry, and your approach to ministry is rooted in a deep theology, and that also seems to me like something that Second has always offered and can especially offer now. I think this is a time that calls out for really deep theological thinking. I think it's easy to rush into action. It's easy to rush into next steps. And I think churches like Second, a gift that we give our community is to say, what does our theology teach us about moments like this? And I know that you and I share a love for the writer Marilyn Robinson, and she takes, there's a gloss she makes on the notion of prevenient grace, that grace that comes before us and allows us to accept God's salvation and grace. And she shifts that and says there is within the Protestant Christian community a prevenient courage, that there's a draw into a courageous witness that is built into us. And as I think about Second all the way back to the 1830s, that courageous church, willing to take steps beyond what they know the future will be, and willing to kind of lean into what they believe God is doing. It seems to me that now is a time for that kind of, to tap that prevenient courage that is a part of our DNA and who we are.
That makes it an exciting time. I have to say, I think it's wonderful to be a minister at this point in time. Now, I suspect there's mornings you may wake up and say, well, I'm not so sure about that. But think of our Reformed heritage. I think it's a gift that is meant to be shared with the world. So much of, and I'll tip my hand this much to say, so much of what I see in religion today is really so thin and shallow. But to have a faith that is thoughtful, that is grounded in deep thinking. And what is God about in our world? And how do we put our arms around God's world? And what does it mean to be, at least as I understand our faith, Calvin's emphasis in me was also about what's it mean to live as a Christian? There's nothing against these experiences, but a one-night stand with God is not, that's not what faith is all about. It's deeper, it's more profound. So you're right on target. And I think there's a yearning for that kind of depth.
I want to, I'm so grateful for your time, and I could talk to you for hours and hope we'll continue the conversation. But I did want to end by asking you a personal question. We just shared with the congregation the really difficult decision that we have had to make to continue to worship online really through the summer. And while we are confident that that is the right decision for our community and living out that theology of who we are as God's people, we also recognize, and certainly I'm chief among those who grieve that and the loss that we experience in that. But my personal question is, how are you and Edie experiencing Sunday morning worship at Second these days? What's your worship routine in pandemic times?
Well, we have a wonderful Sunday morning. My Sunday morning has changed significantly. I do some things that I wanted to do. I get up, and I watch the news, the weekly news shows, which I was never able to do. So I do that. I read the paper. Then we have our coffee and we sit and we have worship.
Yes.
And then Edie and I, then we have our own brunch, which we share together. So we make an omelet, and we say sometimes we were going out and having an omelet, but then if we went to Patachou's, they always had this cinnamon sugar toast. So we also make that. So we've got a routine on Sunday morning that we rather like.
Yes, I love it. I love it. I imagine that many of us could say our Sunday morning routines are different, and I get fantastic pictures. Of course, my favorites are children who are, right up in front of the television for the children's moment, or have their hands clapped together in prayer. Those always get to me. But I also get a fair number of pictures of people who are now worshiping with their pets, which is certainly a new dynamic.
Well, in our home, you have two middle-aged octogenarians who do the prayer clap with you.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, Bill, I am so grateful for you, for your ministry and leadership, for the legacy that you have left at Second Church, and for the ways that you continue to lead us. I will say that in my 2 years, no one has been a bigger supporter or mentor to me than you have, and that means the world to me. So thank you, and thank you for the gift of this time and sharing with our congregation.
Well, I thank God for you, Chris. Your sermons are so exceptional, and for me, that is a gift for which I am most grateful. So bless you. Stay doing what you're doing. And I think the future for Second is really exciting with you at the helm.
May it be so. Thanks be to God, and thanks to you, Bill.
Bless you.
Bless you.
Okay. Bye-bye.